Hello friends, we start lesson 12 today by looking at the future active and the future middle tenses. One of the things that Croy starts by talking about is something called the principal parts of verbs. This is something to keep in the back of your mind. It'll make more sense as we go along and we add a few more tenses to the mix. But the basic idea is that there are 6 principal parts, 6 basic patterns, and if you know the 6 principal parts of any verb, you basically know how they're going to act otherwise, right? You know, you can form them in any tense, any voice, if you know that basic pattern. Everything that we've learned so far is part of the first principal part. That the present active, the present middle passive, the imperfect active, and the imperfect middle passive, they're following some basic patterns. And what we're doing is the stem is basically staying the same, and we're adding different sets of endings. We're adding active endings, we're adding middle passive endings, and sometimes we're dealing with primary tenses and secondary tenses. And in this constellation of ideas, in that first principal part, if you know how the present active indicative is formed, then you're pretty sure you know how the imperfect is formed as well. The future is what's called the future active is the second principal part. It's a new pattern, it's a new set of changes to these verbs. But a pretty straightforward one that hopefully doesn't trip us up too much. Again, we've seen this chart throughout our time together. All we're doing in this lesson is adding a new tense, the future tense, the future tense. Here, we're going to translate this as in the future, right? So instead of I loosen in the present and I was loosening in the middle, we are translating in the future either I will loosen or just I will loosen, just I will loosen. So when it comes to translating the future, we can translate it either as I will loosen or I will be loosening. Either a simple future, I will loosen, or an ongoing future, I will be loosening. So in that way, the future is like the present. It's got both those meanings within it. But let's see how we form the future. Again, we can take any verb, we can split it into 2. In this case, we're just going to grab the stem. If you remember, what we did with the imperfect is that we added an augment. No augments here because the future is not in the past. But instead, we'll take the stem, we'll add a sigma to it, and then we'll add an ending. And look at that ending. That's an ending that you recognize. It's the same ending that we had with the present active indicative. The difference between the present active indicative and the future active indicative is that presence of the sigma between the stem and the ending. And of course, we can change the ending and go from luso to luces, another ending that you recognize. From luces, we can go to luce, a third ending that you recognize. So what you notice here is that we're recycling the endings from the present active indicative. We have our stem, lu. We have our sigma that tells us we're going into the future. And then the present active indicative endings that we've seen before, luso, luces, luce, lusamen, lucete, and lususi. The very same endings that we had before, all showing up again. And again, we can translate luso either I will loosen or I will be loosening. To these, we can then also add the future middles. Now remember, with the present and the imperfect, the middle and the passive forms were exactly the same. Future is a little bit different. There is a future middle form, and later on we're also going to learn a future passive form. This is only future middle. And you'll notice that we've seen these endings before. We've got the stem, lu. We've got the sigma that tells us we're going into the future. And then we've got those middle passive endings that we saw with the present middle passive. So again, some forms that we've seen before. The only difference here is the inclusion of a sigma between the stem and the ending. So usually we can just add a sigma to any stem and we're fine. But there's also certain consonants that don't want to stand next to sigmas. This is a bit like, if you remember with the imperfects, that certain verbs that start with vowels don't like to have an augment added to it, so those vowels lengthen. What's going to happen here instead is that we're going to have certain consonants, when they join up with a sigma, they're going to form related but different sounds. So if you look at the chart, we've got these letters arranged in a couple different ways. So number one, look at that first row, labials. So make the sound that you would make with these letters. So with the P, you go p, p, p. Or with a beta, you go b, b, b. Or with a phi, you go f, f, f. You'll notice you're using your lips to form these consonants. And that the p, 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 a P is voiceless. The b, b, b is voiced. You notice how you're using your voice a bit differently there. And the f, 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 a phi is aspirated. You're putting air through your lips to form this. So if a consonant ends in a P, a beta, or a phi, a p, b, or f sound, notice what happens. You add a sigma to it and it becomes a psi, that psi sound. And basically what you're doing is that's the sound you make when you add an S sound to a labial, to a word you're already forming with a sound you're already forming with your lips. So psi, bsi, psi. You can imagine how Greek, somebody who speaks Greek would prefer to say, instead of psi or bsi or psi, is to say psi. So if your verb ends with a P, a beta, or a phi, you try to turn it into the future, what's going to happen? It's going to change to psi. Same thing with the palatals. So here, these are sounds that are made with the palate, especially with the top of your mouth. So sounds like k of kappa and g of gamma. Notice how it's voiced. And k of the key. All those, when you add a sigma to it, become a kasi. And again, notice that kasi sound comes from your palate. It's a palatal. So those sounds will lead you to form a kasi instead of just adding a sigma. Last are the dentals. So letters like tau, t, and delta, d, and theta, th. Notice how you're using your teeth. These are why they're called dentals. You're using your teeth to make these sounds. These just don't like hanging out with sigmas at all. So the taus, the deltas, the thetas, if your verb ends in one of these letters, then that letter is going to drop out and all that's left is a sigma. Same thing will often happen with zetas. So if a verb ends with a zeta and you try to make it a future tense verb, you add a sigma to the stem, that zeta is also going to tend to disappear, just leaving a sigma. So if you go back to the chart, the three letters that we need to look out for if we're looking for a future is psis, ksis, and sigmas. And again, knowing the vocab here will help us, because if you know how the word is supposed to look, the way it's supposed to sound, you'll notice when a sigma was added, even when it's got these combinations of letters. This is very common, very regular. There's also, of course, some irregular futures along the way. And some of these are best learned as their own vocab words. And some of them you'll be able to kind of catch what's going on here. So genomai becomes genesomai in the future. And it still kind of looks like it. It's got a sigma that tells us in the future. It still kind of looks like genomai, so not too difficult. Same thing with genosko. Genosko becomes nosomai. So we still have that gamma in the new that helps us know this is genosko. But notice what happens to genosko in the future. Now it ends in omai, which means that genosko, that's a regular verb in the present tense, has now become deponent in the future. So nosomai has that middle passive ending, omai, but is actually an active verb. We can parse it as middle passive, but we're going to translate it as an active verb, I will know, or I will be knowing. Erkomai is one of these that's very common, but also quite irregular, so it's better to learn eleusomai, I will go, as its own verb instead of trying to figure out a way to remember that these two are connected. It might be better just to learn it as its own vocab word. Same thing with estheo becomes phagomai in the future. The trick with that one is that there's no sigmas there. So again, learning it as a future I will eat is important. Eurisco, not as tricky, becomes eureso. We've got the sigma that's telling us in the future. We still have the stem there to help us. And of course, there's just more irregulars along the way. Echo becomes hexo, right, with that rough breathing mark. Thaumazo can be thaumasomai or thaumaso. That second one is what we would expect, but sometimes we see it become deponent thaumasomai. Lambano becomes lampsomai. This is quite common. We see it quite a bit. So this is another one to learn as its own vocab word. And then pharaoh strangely becomes oiso, which looks nothing like pharaoh. Again, better to learn it as its own vocab word. So there's a handful of irregular futures that we need to watch out for. But most of the time when we're talking about just adding a sigma to the stem, the sigma is just going to be there pretty straightforward. And the stuff in section 78 about certain kind of consonants not liking standing next to a sigmas, those we're going to see and we're going to get used to those pretty quickly. It's these irregular futures that might need a little bit of extra study. Last thing for this lesson is the future indicative of ame. We've learned the present indicative of ame, the imperfect indicative of ame, and now this is the future indicative of ame. The good news here is that the endings are exactly what we would expect. They look just like those future middle endings that we're just learning now, and that they actually also look a lot like the present middle passive endings. The other big thing here is that there's a sigma right after the epsilon in all these forms. So we've got a sigma, middle passive endings that will here help us identify the future indicative of ame. So where should we spend time? Primarily is getting used to seeing these verbs that have a stem plus the sigma added to it, especially when the sigma is running into consonants that don't like to standing next to each other. You'll get used to that. And then notice then that here you have a chance to relearn those endings that we learned with the present active and the present middle passive. Those endings are being recycled, used exactly alike in the future active and the future middle. But that's it for today. We'll see you next time.